it's really cool to see when an athlete's been going through a really tough time with like injuries. They come in and then they go, and I teach them like, hey, when you go to a PT, you should ask these questions. They should respond this way. If they're very defensive, then you should start asking them this, like how to navigate a lot of these health avenues. And so I've had a lot of athletes like, I've been with a PT for 2 years. And once I started challenging what they were doing, I realized that for the last 2 years, it's been BS.
Welcome to the Athletic Edge podcast. I'm your host, Liam Evans, strength and conditioning coach and owner of Evans Performance. This is a podcast tailored for athletes, coaches, and parents interested in every facet of athletic development. Join me and guests from around the world as we dive into game-changing tools and expert insights covering strength training, performance enhancement, and long-term athletic development strategies. Uncover the keys to elevate your athletic potential, drawing from trusted resources to safely and effectively navigate your training and build your athletic edge.
Welcome back to the Athletic Edge podcast. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Tommy Hansen. Tommy is a strength and conditioning coach, owner of Perform for Life Gym, and director of sports performance at Top Flight Volleyball Club. Welcome to the show, Tommy.
Thanks for having me, Liam. Glad to be here.
Appreciate it. Before we get too much into anything, do you want to just give people that may not know who you are a quick background on you, your experiences, your education, all those sorts of things?
Sure. So you alluded to a few things there. So right now I own a company called Perform for Life. Been doing that for about 2 years now. And also I work side by side with a volleyball club here in the Chicago area. And prior to that, so growing up, I was a 4-sport athlete in high school. I ended up walking on to a community college, playing baseball for 2 years, then got a scholarship to play at a university where I played 1 year. And then I didn't have a senior year because of COVID. So I still got 1 year of eligibility left if I want to go back and play as a washed up athlete. So I got an opportunity there. But after that, I took an internship at Northern Illinois University, which is the Huskies. They're my hometown team. And then from there, I worked at a commercial gym as an employee, as a personal trainer, training athletes, Gen Pop, elderly, pretty much a wide variety of populations. From there, I went to TCU in Texas and got an internship with Coach Zach Dakant, which is a very renowned internship opportunity for many young coaches. And I'm really glad I went there. It's a good experience for me. But ultimately, I ended up coming back home to my hometown, starting a sports performance training business here. I did some training where I leased some space at another gym. And then the last 8 months or so, I've had my own facility. And since then, I've been doing that alongside the volleyball club stuff. And that's where I'm at now.
Yeah, it's funny because I think we have a pretty similar background in a lot of things. Both played college sports, and then I did my internships Northern Kentucky and then University of Florida, and then also came back and kind of came home, started my own thing in the strength conditioning world. What from that internship with at TCU was that again? What would you say are some of the most pivotal things you got out of that?
For me, I never really went. A lot of people like to take big logo internships in the hopes that it gives them an edge on their resume. That was never really my intention going down there. I wanted to learn from a high level coach because I knew I would personally develop if I went down there. I didn't know anybody down there, so I had to figure it out, go learn, hang out, meet new people, get new friends, an environment where you know nobody, high pressure. I knew I was going to get pushed to be developed. And so that's the main reason I had gone down there, kind of see where I stood as if I was a good coach. I was ahead of the curve. I was way behind. It was kind of the test of where I would be at when I went down there. And so one of the best things that came out of that is that I got thrown into the fire immediately. So I was there for like 2 days and Coach Dakin came up and said, all right, you're running it tomorrow. And I'm like, that was quick. And so you're in a room with 40 guys with a lot of those guys being potential draft picks, and you got to figure it out. You got to know how to run the warm up. You got to command a room. You got to know how the program works. You got to study it. You got to be ready to go, because if you aren't, I mean, a lot of those guys are smart. Those guys are quick. Those guys have been doing this program for a long time. You got to have your stuff together. And so I liked being a part of that. And that ultimately, that has translated massively into what I'm doing now, because I work with tons of athletes at one time. With the volleyball club, I'm working with 176 girls in one night. So I have to manage that many. And being able to bounce around like a pinball and solve problems on the fly, that's probably the number one thing I took from it. On top of that, the education piece with all the other interns, we pushed each other to get better. So yes, I learned a lot of like good, valuable strength conditioning information down there. But the biggest thing was you had to have your stuff together. And if you didn't, they were going to tell you about it. And then if you didn't fix it, then you didn't get the opportunity to coach as much as you'd like because they couldn't trust you to run a spot. So you had to get your stuff together, and that's really translated to what I'm doing now. And I was a lot more confident leaving there than when I went there. So that was probably the biggest piece for me.
Yeah, for sure. I've found a lot of similar stuff. You talk about training over 100 volleyball girls at either in the same training session or at least in the same consecutive hours. What are the challenges with that, and how have you kind of gone about that? And what have you found to work for you in those situations?
Yeah, so pretty much when you're in groups that large, so I run a warm up with all 170 of them at the same time. So we have a giant like space that I've got space for. I think it's about 15 teams or so.
Yeah,
And we run a warm up together. That's the only thing that's done together, because running 176 people in the weight room at one time is, unless if you have everything down to a T, it don't work because that's a massive number.
yeah,
So what we do is every 30 minutes, we shuffle 32 girls back there, and we have 8 squat racks, 4 to a rack, and we kind of circulate like that. So that's how we've done it. But even within that, the challenges that become is that some people have so before I started training there, the only reason I got there is because I had a few girls that trained with me privately that tried to push
yeah,
for me to go train there. So I was managing people that have been with me for about a year with a lot of experience in knowing how to do my program, with a bunch of people who've never touched a weight before. And so you have a massive range of people you got to deal with. The easiest thing that I have found is find exercises that, including plyos, sprints, jumps, everything needs to be super easily scalable. So you don't want to be too technical with your variations that you're using. You want principles that they can follow. So an easy example is if you've never done like a pogo hop or something like that. If you feel like that when you hit the ground, you're folding up like a lawn chair and you're going to collapse, stay low. If you feel like you're bouncy, get up a little bit higher. And then the thing is, if they play games, I tell them, if you're playing this weekend, give me 60%. If you don't play, I want to see you get up. So it's like little variations like here and there. And that's how I've been able to go about it. We've seen some pretty good results doing it that way. But you have to say very simple with what you're doing and make it super easily scalable. Because if you don't, it's just going to be a nightmare, and you're trying to specialize and specify everything for everybody. It don't work like that. It's really hard, and you got to make sure that it's as simple as possible. Use as few words as possible because your time is also limited.
yeah. And you're right. It does present a little bit of a challenge when you do have such varying experience levels. I've been in a similar situation where kids I've trained privately for a couple years now, obviously are experienced, know what they're doing, and then go into maybe I'm training their whole team for a session or whatever it is. And then, yeah, one kid's learning how to goblet squat, another kid is front squat and 200 pounds, whatever it is. Do you like to kind of give them a little bit of autonomy in that some of your experienced girls or guys, whoever it is, can help those that are a little less experienced, or how do you work that?
So what I give them is their entire program is, I have like a general structure and weights I want them to use, but there's a lot of autonomy within it.
Yeah.
So pretty much what I do is every day they come back, I have a sheet with what I have warm-up weights and starting weights for them. And they come in, they look at that, they know what their starting weight is, and then I give them like a reps in reserve range that they need to be in. And so they know
Yeah.
what their starting weight is. And usually based on the numbers I've gathered, because I've tracked their data for about 8 weeks, so I kind of know where a lot of them are at. So then what I'll give them is I'm like, okay, everybody's doing 5 reps. I want you to leave 3 reps in the tank. And normally that starting weight is like an RPE-ish of like 6. So it's around that range already. So if they're feeling good, they might go up to an 8, but at least their starting weight is already at around that 6. So I have it structured where even if they don't know, because if I tell somebody, they're like, you need to do 3 reps left in the tank. Some of them have zero clue what that even means. So because some of them will be like, oh, this is really hard. I could probably do 2 more. And when I look at it, they're like, oh, I could probably do, in my head, I'm like, you could probably do like 10 more. And that's usually what it comes with novices. So tracking that up to that point and giving them like a starting weight at least ensures that they're getting some out of it, because they're using a weight that I know is relatively challenging to them. But from there, if it's moving quick, I encourage them like, hey, go up a little bit. So I'm running around the room like crazy. Like, that looked really easy. Go up. That looked really easy. Go up. That looked really go up. And so I think that as strength coaches, we like to get very, very, I wouldn't say closed-minded, but like very structured in this is the percentage that you're using. But and that's good in big groups, but I still think there needs to be some level of autonomy, however you want to do it. Because 70% one day is 90% another day and 50% another day. So if they're starting already in that range, if they're feeling good, especially in a group environment where they're pushing each other, that entire group might go up 10 pounds heavier than they normally do. So I think that's a good blend, and we need to somehow make the athletes advocates for themselves so that they enjoy and they feel like they're actively part of it instead of me saying, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this, no variation for the program. I don't like that.
Yeah, autonomy is huge for me. Obviously, when they're just starting out, we want to be kind of on them, making sure everything is spick and span. But again, once they get a little more experience, I want them to, yeah, I'll give them a starting weight, or like you said, if there's somebody that understands RPE or reps in reserve, anything like that, then we communicate that to them. Building on that, one of the most important things with any athlete, but especially with high school athletes, is getting through to them the importance of intent when we do lifts and exercise, whether it's plyos or actual lifts. How do you one communicate that to your athletes that, you know, a squat done with lightweight or no intent or whatever is a lot different than a squat or a jump or anything else with that intent, and we get different results or better results if we're actually doing things to our best of our ability on that day. Like you said, it might be different depending on the day, but how do you go about communicating that to your athletes?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up because that's probably the biggest limiting factor I've seen in almost every athlete I've ever trained. So privately, I've had probably about 120 athletes come to me in the last 2 years, and publicly now with the club, I have about 170. So I have about 300 athletes now in my own database, I guess I could say. And I've had zero on day one come in and know that they're supposed to move stuff with intent. Zero. I've had zero do that because that's kind of my day one test where I'm like, all right, we're gonna do a squat, and I see them warm up. If they have a sub max weight and they're like barely doing enough to get up, I'm like, okay, that's never been communicated to them. So the first thing is communicating to like, hey, this is something that's extremely important. But in order to get through to them, usually I like to reflect. Anytime you can reflect it on them and make them like feel like they're taking ownership of something, it'll get through to them more. So at the club, every single one of them want to jump higher. I'm like, do you really want to jump higher? Then you will show me you want to jump higher. If you're not moving with max intent, I can't do anything for you. It's up to you to do that. So anytime that you can reflect on and be like, hey, if you don't do this, it's nobody's fault but your own that you're not jumping higher. Even though I can't guarantee that getting your squat heavier will increase your jump. It's a
Yeah.
motive that, hey, if I'm not giving my best effort at these exercises, I'm not even giving myself the chance to raise the ceiling. And so when you reflect that on them, they're like, oh, I actually have to, I don't just do the exercise. I actually have to do it a certain way if I actually want to get a result from it. And with so many girls within the club and within what I'm doing, there's going to be some where they're like, oh, this is nonsense. You know, you're not going to get through to every athlete. But then again, you can use that as leverage later to them to be like, they're after 8 weeks, they're like, oh, my jump's not going up. I'm like, I've been watching you. I've been on you about this. I can tell you're taking reps off. So whose fault is that? And then eventually, like, oh, sometimes it takes a while for it to kick in. They're like, oh, maybe I should have been doing that the whole time. So anytime you can reflect it on them to make, and then make it a team effort, be like, hey, I want this for you, but I can't do this for you, and make it like a team thing, then usually that gets through to them pretty well. But then again, you're not going to get through to all of them. It's just, can you do it for the masses that way?
Yeah, exactly. And I've also found, even trying to compare it to whatever sport they play, because it's like if they're a volleyball player, if you're just going through the motions at training, do you ever really expect to get better at playing volleyball? And in the weight room with whatever you're doing, it's essentially the same thing. Um, Before we get too much into the actual training, you spoke about you do your warm up with all your athletes. Even whether it's the volleyball players in the big group or just your private small group trainings, however you run them, what are some of the things you're trying to hit in the warm up to prepare them for the lift?
I'm not too picky about a lot of stuff. So for privately, because my groups are a lot smaller, I'm able to do a lot more creative fun games with a lot of them. Like yesterday, for example, I probably spent an hour of my day playing spike ball along with a lot of my athletes.
It's
So
the best.
spike ball is probably the best dynamic warm up you'll find. You'll get deep positions, change of direction, reactive, fun, engaging, just hypes them up. I try, especially my youth athletes too, at my facility. I try to do like fun tennis ball games where they're jumping over hurdles and make it competitive. I'll sprinkle in some mobility drills just because, like, yeah, that's something they should be doing before they train. But the way they raise their heart rate, I don't really care. And so in my facility, that's how I do it. But in the big group setting where I have 176 people at one time, that becomes a challenge. But I don't want it to be this line of robots doing things that you'd see in like your standard dynamic warm up where you're just kicking your feet, touching your toes, grabbing, doing like a knee hug, and everyone's talking and kind of just like super. It's a real lazy thing. I don't think that gets anything done. So what I like to do is I found, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Zach Dakin's 3D movement prep that he's got.
I think I've seen a bit about it, but yeah.
Yeah, so pretty much it's a way of like, it is standardized to where you are in lines doing things, but it's really challenging from a coordinative standpoint. So you're doing like karaoke's with 2 1-foot patterns, forward backward karaoke's where you're skipping and then you're jumping. It's a lot
Yeah, I've
more
seen, yeah.
engaging, and it's a lot more like free playing and free flying where everybody's messing it up. But when they're laughing and the energy is there, that's when I know like at least they're enjoying what we're doing, or it's actually challenging them, which for me is more important than just moving around and doing something super boring. So for example, when I do the warm up with them, I'll choose 4 or 5 movement skills that we do. We do it for about 20 to 30 yards. I'll give them like a karaoke skip. I'll give them just different ways, and I'll change it up every week so that they don't get bored with anything. I'll change a few here and there and throw some other ones in there. But I do that, and then I'll do some sort of new mobility drill that challenges them with their balance, or just something that keeps them engaged. And usually by then their heart rates are engaged because it's elevated because they're yelling at their teammates, they're laughing because they can't figure it out. But to me, that's more important, because that's ultimately all we're chasing is a warm up, is engagement. We're chasing increasing their heart rate to get them ready, and then throwing some mobility drills that are similar to what you're going to see in the weight room. If you check those boxes, you're pretty good and early, no matter how you do it.
And you mentioned something that I think is really cool in there, which is the free play part. And especially, obviously, structure in a session is important, but I think especially with kids, it's also important to give them some time to just explore movements and do things for themselves. And like you said, if the goal is just to get their heart rate up, there's so many ways you can do that. You may as well make it fun. Like one thing I never want my athletes to do is dread coming to the gym. So if you can give them that little bit, then obviously we can get it back in other places. But I see even on your social media and stuff, you're big on the free play and even the free jumps and things like that. Why do you incorporate that in, and how does it kind of translate to getting the buy-in with the athlete for the rest of the session?
So two things there. So I add it, especially for my youth athletes, is because their favorite thing to do is jumping over my hurdles. Like this is probably the cheapest thing I have in my gym, but it's the thing everybody loves to do.
Yeah.
So if I have kids for an hour, I do something every day with my kids called freestyle hurdles, which is basically they partner up, they get a hurdle, and I tell them, you can jump over this however you want. All that happens is if you and your partner knock it over 2 times in a row, like he hits it, then she hits it or something like that, then they're done and they get to sit and watch everybody else go. So it's like they want to challenge themselves, but they also don't go too crazy where they're just flipping over it and almost hurting themselves. So it gives them a little bit of a buffer there. But they tell me, like, when they go to school, they're like, I couldn't concentrate in class today because all I could think about was jumping over the hurdles today. And I'm like, that's a good and a bad thing. But I was like, but I'm just excited that that's the reason they want to come to training. So one reason especially for the younger kids, is that it keeps them wanting to come back, and it keeps them, because I tell them, like, hey, if you don't do good on the other stuff that we're doing, we ain't going to do this. So it keeps them also engaged in that stuff. Giving them just freedom to be kids, that's a big thing. And two, one thing that I've noticed, and this isn't just with my kids, I've noticed this with my college athletes and my higher level high school athletes, the more variation and freedom to kind of do more engaging things, the better the results have gotten, especially with the jumps and the speed stuff. Like I used to test, like I test quite a bit, but I used to be like by the book. We'll do 3x5 box jumps. We'll do this, kind of like this is the sets and reps. Now I kind of just set times and then throw a lot of things together. So it'll be like, okay, we got 6 minutes. I want for the first 3 minutes, you're doing this jump variation. And then this one, I want to spread the hurdles apart and you figure out how to get over it. And they're doing like 180s and they're jumping far, they're jumping high. And I don't know if it's you can't really draw causative inference from it, but the more I've done that, and I think just by the engagement piece of it, a lot of that has helped the other fuel energy toward the other stuff, which has made everything in the session just more productive. And I mean, in my own training, I've noticed that my jump and my speed have gone up the more chaotic it's gotten. So like when I'm just freestyling over my hurdles, I'm sending it. Like you have no excuse just to get over the hurdle and jump as high as you can. And I'll change it up. I'll do 2 minutes of one, 2 minutes of another. And I've just noticed that my jumps have gotten better since I've done that. It's more fun. So I think there's a lot to it, but I think it should be, regardless of level, even if it's professional athletes. They love gamifying things. I think it should be part of every athlete's program.
And when you're doing those jumps, how important or how much do you cue and coach the actual technique of the jump? And obviously, when it's a free play, it might be a little different. But say they're doing, an approach jump to a vertex or off a mat or anything like that. How are you looking at that?
So I still think that when I'm doing I still have a lot of structured hurdles within there. But for me, it's like, do I want slow contact time or do I want fast contact time? And so for me, it's how do you put those into part with still making it fun? So if I do 5 hurdles in a row, reactive, where they're jumping as high as they can, as quick as they can off the ground, or it's like I spread the hurdles out and it's a long jump to a high jump, the variation is there, but the mechanism is very similar. So it's still like I'm still getting that short contact time. I'm still getting max height on the jumps. It's just how do I do that within a way that I think's fun? It doesn't always have to be like training's a party, but I think that you should make drills engaging within the scope of what you're trying to get out of it. And I think that's an important piece.
Yeah, no, that's super important. Even because you work with a volleyball club as well, how do you balance the fact that they obviously get jumps in their sport and in their practice versus the plyos and jumps that they're doing with you? Is that something you look at closely, or are you doing such low volume that maybe it doesn't matter?
Their practices are very chaotic. So sometimes they'll jump a lot, sometimes they won't. So just in general, to be safe, back when they're with me, the volume is low. But also, I'm really fortunate that they have allowed me to come in and run the warm up. Along with the warm up, we do plyos and we do speed work every single day before they go into practice. So I'm already given the most fresh part of their practice to do what I need to do, which is really helpful. So it's not like I'm coming in, they're running their own warm up, and then I get them sporadically for the plyos. I can set it up in a way where at the beginning, when they're fresh, I can do whatever I want and get them done in the most fresh way, which obviously is the most important thing. If you want to get faster and jump higher, you got to be fresh. And so the fact that they've allowed me to come in and do that, most of our stuff is being done there. And then when they come back to lift with me in their 30-minute increments, usually I'll throw like 1 or 2 reps in of other jumps, but then most of it is just lifting. So I'm set up in a good scenario to where we can check the boxes at the right time. And that's been really easy for me to program in an effective way for them.
Yeah, and we talk about jumps. Are you also with those athletes running sprints with them? And for those listening by sprints, I'm not talking about conditioning sprints. I mean, low volume, high intensity sprints.
Scheduling with them is probably the biggest barrier because you have some that play games Saturday and Sunday, then you have other ones that don't. And so you have to figure out what days am I going to sprint to where some of them are going to get a lot out of it, and other ones that I don't hurt them because they played 9 games over a weekend. So how I structure that is first, I when I came in, I was like, I don't want these girls doing unnecessary conditioning because running, especially in volleyball, you shouldn't be just running. And that's what you were alluding to. Running is not sprinting, and that's not speed training. Sprinting is how fast can I get from point A to point B, and that's all that matters. So what we do is we just take that so they practice Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Wednesday is our big sprint day. So we sprint on Wednesdays because it's the furthest away from the weekend. That's likely when most people are going to be fresh. But still on Mondays and Fridays, we still run buildups at about 80 to 90%. So we're touching close to it, but we're not actually sprinting on those days. And it's very low volume. So that's how I throw that in there. And I get a lot of questions of, why do you run longer end sprints with the volleyball players? So I'll run 25 to 30, 35, maybe up to 40-yard sprints at times with them. And so speed is kind of the thing that lifts all ships. It's like the tide that lifts all ships. If you get better at running faster, it can bleed over into a lot of different things in your athleticism. Like if you've never seen an athlete, or an athlete's never ran at actual top speed, it can get very, very ugly. And that's not because they're not good at running. It's the fact that it's so demanding at high speeds. Sometimes they're like, I don't know how to manage myself running this fast or moving this fast. And so I think that's a big part. And we only do it once or twice a month at that distance probably. But it's important that you do that frequently and you do it when they're the freshest. And like you said, conditioning, you got to strategically manage that. Otherwise, that can hinder everything else that you do.
And you touched on something there, which is super important. And it's why good strength and conditioning programs, no matter what the sport is, should include some variation of speed training. And it can be low volume. It doesn't have to be 8 times a week. It's just getting those high outputs in once or twice a week. But what I want you to maybe touch on is because volleyball, you could argue, is the same with a lot of sports, track and field aside, where running isn't a huge part or even sprinting. Why is it still important? Could you explain to athletes or people listening why it's still important to do those sprints, CNS and all those sorts of things, even in the sports where, you're not actually going to build up to a full sprint at any time?
Yeah. So one thing is, I think the biggest piece of it is probably resilience. Is that you will not find, and most sport injuries happen at high speeds at unpredictable moments where you have to contract really fast. Either you're running really fast or you're reacting really, really fast, and you just aren't quite ready for it. So the more times that you can expose yourself to the thing that is going to be faster than anything else you do, by definition, that's at least going to make you resilient in some aspects. It's not going to prevent everything, but if you want resilient hamstrings, you're going to have to run fast. And that's the thing is it's a double-edged sword. It's going to keep you resilient, but also it's the thing that's most likely to get you hurt. So it's a risk versus reward type of thing, but every athlete still needs to do it. And so one reason that I use it with the volleyball players is not only from that aspect, but the contact times are extremely fast. So you can just see when you watch your athletes run, like, hey, they actually can't stabilize and hit the ground and react very quick off the ground as quick as you think they can. Just building that general motor quality of stiffness when you hit the ground is something that's that demanding can help them create a lot of stiffness in their other activities that they're doing. Because I know many athletes have attributed max velocity sprinting to getting better at jumping off of one leg, because that's very similar. It's not the same. You still have to practice jumping off one leg, but the mechanisms are similar and the speed is higher and the demand on the nervous system is higher. So it's kind of this blend of like, not everything in the weight room has to mimic your sport, but you have to understand where there's overlaps. And most things aren't black and white. It's more like they're like Venn diagrams where they're both important, but they both have like this overlapping swirl of like, this can help this, but we don't know how much, but we know it does a little bit. So you have to know kind of where they blend.
Yep. And how do you, in your sessions and in your programming, take away speed now and even the plyometric side, but more so with your general strength activities and things like that? How do you blend that where, obviously we have stuff that 80% of athletes are going to do no matter what sport they play, and then maybe that 20% or whatever it is for that coach, that's, your quote unquote sport specific, if you even do any of that at all. How do you approach that? Because I'm sure you've had it as well. You also get parents that want super sport specific training or things like that. So how do you approach those sort of questions?
So what I like to do is I do have subtle variations of athletes depending on what they're doing. So like baseball players and volleyball players, I will spend a little bit more time with I'll daily dose more rotator cuff and trap, like low trap work and stuff like that. But it's not like you said 80-20. It's more like 5 to 10 in my program. It's not that much. So because most of your athletic feats are going to come from one, building an ultra big engine and then taking that engine and just full sending it and maxing out on what you're doing in your sport. So if you get like for a volleyball player, I get a lot of questions of how do I increase swing power? How do I do this? How do I keep my shoulder safe? They all kind of, like we said before, they all kind of blend into one another. So like I've seen some girls just get really strong at chin-ups and their shoulder problems tend to drift away a little bit. Like sometimes it's just that added piece. So they all blend. And then it's like, oh, how do I hit harder? Oh, you do chin-ups. Sequencing is really important. Like all these things are very important, but I think many people they try to take weight room solutions to sport problems. So like I can work sequencing on a med ball throw in like a baseball athlete or a volleyball athlete. Like you want to go proximal to distal where you go hips, torso, arm, shoulder, hand, however you want to say that, just proximal to distal. I can teach that with different med ball throws, but if they can't do that in a game, the med ball itself, throwing that a little bit harder probably won't be a big ROI. It might be maybe slightly, but the sequencing of the sport itself is more important than the general thing that I'm doing in the weight room. So when you're saying the weight room stuff, I'm extremely general with the weight room stuff. For volleyball, the only difference I'll take from other athletes is say you have volleyball versus football. Football, I'll sprint them a little bit more. Volleyball, I'll have them hit some more approach jumps. But in general, 90% is very, very similar. And that's what I've been doing, and I've found pretty good success doing it that way.
Yeah, and so going straight into that, what are some of the things that are just standard in your program, whether it's a you know, high school athlete, college athlete, volleyball player, baseball player, football, whatever it is, that are some of the things that the boxes that you want to tick when you're doing the sessions?
So for most of my athletes, one is I work with a lot of like elastic athletes, so hoopers, volleyball players, even some soccer players here and there. I would take a little different approach, like if I had a football lineman. So I'm speaking of more of like maybe your
Yeah, yeah,
sprinters
yeah,
and stuff
yeah,
like that. A lineman would be an
yeah.
exception to this, but for most of my athletes, if they can't hop on one leg without collapsing, like if they can't hit the ground and come back up, for me, that's an automatic red flag. So like they can sprint all they want, but if they sprint and their legs are hitting the ground and kind of like falling over and they don't have very much stiffness, and then I take them over and like, oh, you can't even hop on one leg for 20 yards without looking like you're in quicksand.
Yeah.
And so that's like one of my big things is can you hop on one leg and can you do it effectively? And so that's honestly becoming one of my biggest staples for most of my athletes. Like, can you do this? It's just a general thing, but it can tell you a lot of clues on how they're moving. So that's one. Two, when it comes to weight room stuff, normally like I don't really have weight room standard numbers, but if I'm like a female athlete, if I can't squat near my body weight, usually that's a little bit of a red flag. That's just a general marker. It's not, but then again, it becomes complicated because I have a two volleyball players. One is extremely strong, one is not strong at all. They both touch the exact same height on their approach. One of them can squat 200 pounds, they weigh 150 pounds. The other one can barely squat 65 pounds, but yet they're touching the same thing. They're the exact same height. So I'm like, is weight room numbers really that important? Yes, they should generally know how to take their joints through full range of motion, but or under load through full range of motion, but I don't really have standards. You can tell if someone picks up a weight and just falls over and they're like, oh, this is clearly a red flag, but I don't really have standards for that. So pretty much my movement, I guess my boxes are hopping on one leg, um, I guess picking up movement patterns quickly. So like if they can skip sideways, they can gallop, they can high gallop, they can skip for distance. If they pick those things up quickly, then I'm like, okay, they pick up skills quickly. And then one, can they actually sprint at full speed without looking really, really bad? And sometimes just getting them to move fast, effortlessly. So on my, if you look at some of my Instagram stuff, I always talk about effortless athleticism. It should look smooth. So if they're jumping, it shouldn't look like they're a truck, like slowly pulling away. It should look like they're popping all over the place like a rabbit. Like they should look like they're moving freely. And so I know that it's not a great answer to the question because it's very subjective, but I think that's something that those are kind of the things. Those are like my little eyeball tests, but I don't really have weight room standards.
Got you. But even in saying that, are you, you know, in each session, doing a squat variation, a hinge variation, a
Yes.
pull, a push, all those sorts of things with those athletes?
If I only have them 2 days a week, then yes, I'm putting all that in the same thing. So they're jumping, they're sprinting, that gets more general.
Yeah.
But if I got athletes 3 or 4 days a week, there's some days they're coming in. We'll play spike ball. We'll sprint and jump, do a few rotator cuff things. Done. That's it. Like no lifting whatsoever. Maybe a chin up or something on that day. But it all comes down to, again, logistics. If you have them more often, you can do things like that. But if they're like, oh, we can only afford 2 days a week, so we can only come these days, you got to hit all the boxes you can with them. So a lot of it's logistics. But if I had like the ideal situation, I really don't. I think as long as you hit those throughout the week, you don't necessarily have to do the standard squat, hinge, push, pull all on the same day like it says in the textbook. You can freestyle that a little bit and only sprint and jump and leave, come back and lift lower body the next day. You get a lot more freedom, but that's judged by a lot of different factors. Sometimes it's out of your control.
Yeah, and it becomes, essentially what's the lowest hanging fruit and
Yeah.
what are your time constraints and your schedule constraints, especially with high school athletes that honestly have so much going on in their just everyday lives that it can be difficult to get them in, more than like I think 3 times a week is insane if you can get most athletes in for that much, like it with between their schedules and everything. But yeah, actually leading into the next one, how do you one communicate the importance of, but then deal with the in-season training side of things, because then you are constantly dealing with athletes having a competition that weekend, or a ramped up volleyball or whatever sports schedule.
So the club, it's not as hard to manage this on the club because they all are kind of doing the same thing. But when it comes to the private side, this becomes really complicated. So you have to decide, one, do I have the time? Does the schedule allow for me to set this up optimally? And most of the time the answer is no. Most of the time the answer is no. So for me, when it comes to in season, usually, or for right now, I have upperclassmen that come in and they have some more favorable school schedules where they get like early release on some days. That
Yeah,
is
that's
kind of
a
the
lot
big one
easier.
for me. And I can set that up that way. But if you got a kid that's going to school from seven to 3, and then they have practice, and then some nights they have games, you can't alter your schedule for those few kids, because then you're missing out on all the other kids that have off seasons that you're pushing away because you're trying to make this perfect schedule. So either you got to suck it up and do stuff in the morning before school with the kids, or you have to say, hey, you might have to take a break from training with me for now. Here's an online program that you can follow if you have access to a weight room. It's really tough to manage that. But in terms of like in season training, like principles that I follow, the dose that I give them is so small. But the thing is, and I think a lot of coaches have realized this, that sometimes dosing things that small can result in massive gains. And so I had some club volleyball girls that trained with me all school season. And school season compared to club is a breeze. They play every Tuesday, Thursday, and some Saturdays, and then their practices were like 1 hour. So every time they came in, they were fresh. It was like I couldn't have been given a better scenario, but that never happens. But I was like, okay, let's take advantage of it and see what happens. And so we trained every game day. So then every non-game day was an off day. And then so over the course of a season, I had 4 girls in that group. And so I could get really specific with how I was coaching things with them and how we were doing stuff. And all 4 of them, I think, had 2 to 3 inch increase in their verts over a matter of 3 to 4 months of doing that. And I'm like, it opened my eyes. I'm like, when you set things up in an optimal way, sometimes you don't have to do that much. It's just a consistency of outputs that really matters. But the hard part is, how do you take that approach and scale it when the situations aren't super optimal? So that's going to be the thing that no one's ever going to solve. It's kind of just making your best educated guess at that point in
Yeah,
time.
and then it becomes, and it sounds like you've kind of adopted this method as well, but that almost like less is more approach, where we're gonna do less. Again, it comes back to the intent. It's got to be very intentful and very high quality, but the volume's actually going to be much lower, so almost like a minimal effective dose. But we can still get the at least maintain. But like you said, we can even get added benefits to doing that, especially if it's during season. And it's also having that conversation where I have a lot of athletes that'll come and say they have a game on the weekend or a meet, whatever sport they're playing, and it's like, look, we're gonna do something today. It's not gonna be a PR day. It's not gonna be anything crazy, but we're gonna get something in, and it's gonna be intentful. But the volume is gonna be so low that I promise you, you will still be fresh when it comes time for your game. And I found that's really important to communicate those sorts of things so that we can keep them going. Because then you end up with 2, 3, 4 weeks where they don't come in at all, and then it's like getting them back, and you're starting from scratch again.
I'm gonna add one thing to that, and I'm sure that you've dealt with this, is that when you're, especially in the private side, managing outside influences, not games and practices, whether it's going to the rec with the boys or just anything
Yeah.
that's kind of interfering with your training effect, that is a really hard thing to manage at scale. And so, like, for example, I mean, in the volleyball club, I see it too, because I've had girls come up to me like, hey, I'm dying right now. Like, I had lifting at school during gym class, I had basketball lifting after school. There was a track open gym yesterday. I did that. And then now I'm lifting here after I just finished a practice. And I'm just like, I want you to do something, but I understand, like, I can't really, you know?
Yeah.
And I see that all the time. And the hardest thing is with high school kids, because they are required to go to a lot of these like high school workouts that they're doing, which they should be going to these things if they can. But it's a tough blend because they're like, oh, we want to go to you privately to get more results, but then they show up every day sore, and you're like, now I'm pulling from them and they're pulling from me. And I'm like, we have to come up with something here because it's not optimal. And it's hard because within the groups that I have, there's some kids that'll go to these liftings and then there's other kids that don't. And it's this blend of like, okay, I have to dose what I need with the kids that are getting a lot of lifting elsewhere, but also not ruin the flow of my session here. And I'm sure you've dealt with that a lot. It's hard.
It's one of the most difficult things.
There comes a point where you have to have the conversation with them like, hey, how much do you want out of stuff? If you think you're getting a good benefit with me, it might actually be a good time to pull away from the other stuff. If you think you're getting enough from the other stuff, I'm not for you right now. I've sent many kids away because I'm like, I want my brand and what I do to be a high quality service. If the circumstances aren't set up for that, I am more than happy to say I'm not the fit for you. And I think that's hard as a business owner because you can bring like, I've turned away so many people that I probably could have made a lot more money doing like just saying, oh, numbers, everybody come in. I want all the numbers I can. But long term, when you have more unhappy people because nothing's happening because you're in the same place, you're better off just playing the long game and getting the right people slowly than bringing in the masses and having a subpar service.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think, like you said, sometimes it's on us as the hopefully somewhat more experienced or qualified strength and conditioning coaches or anything like that, to be the ones to be like, all right, well, I wanted to get this done with you today, but I know that I'm going to get more out of you if we just, whether it's take away half of the volume or just, go foam roll trigger point today, do some whatever. We're going to take it easy because my thing is always what's going to make you better tomorrow if that we're doing today. But it's a tough pill to swallow because it does get like, I want, them to do my program so that they can see their own results and they can get benefit from that. But at the end of the day, there are more important things than like us as coaches and what we want to get out of it. So yeah, like you said, sometimes you just got to give them what's best for them on that day.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that at the end of the day, even though it's very tempting to want to bring in as many kids as you can, the people that decide that they want to be with you and just say, I want your help and your help only, the value that you can bring them over time, even though it might take a lot longer to manifest, is much more valuable to build that part organically than it is to bring in too many people. Because deep down, I'm sure you're the same way. I feel bad if I'm putting someone in a situation where I'm like, if I was this kid and I don't know I'm not getting out a lot out of it, I feel like sneaky if I'm like, come in, do this. I feel bad doing that. Like morally, I just can't do that. I'd rather be like, you know what? I'm gonna lose out on $500 this month. But I don't want you to be unhappy with what I'm doing here. And so, yeah, it's just a hard blend. But I think over time you'll find that there are a big amount of people that do truly value what you do, and you should hold them dearly and closely and keep them close rather than trying to fish for a few people that might not be of much benefit to you. You gotta stick around the people that are there for you. That's what I've noticed has worked for me.
Yeah, and that's where, the retention is almost more important than anything else. Obviously, you'll always have new interests and new people and new athletes that might be coming in, but doing the best with whoever you have there at that moment, I think is the most important thing. And especially as a business owner like you and I are, like that's how essentially we stay in business and how we keep things going. And then hopefully that leads to the best for these athletes. Building on that though, actually, I know. What is your kind of setup right now? Take away from the volleyball now, more into Perform for Life. As far as your one-on-one individual training, or are you mostly small group, or how does that work? And if you are in the small group setting, why do you think that's so beneficial for youth athletes to kind of be around other youth athletes or high school athletes and training with each other and all that?
So I do both. I have found, especially at the high school level, you have to have a special breed of kid that if they train one-on-one to absolutely bring the energy every single time, you got to have a special kid to do that
Yeah.
because I've almost always like I've had probably 3 or 4 parents this month reach out and be like, "Hey, we want one-on-one training for your kid." I'm like, I get what you're saying, but you'd be surprised how much better off they are served in a group that they're going to thrive in.
Hmm.
And so the way that I have things set up is I would say I'm 95% groups. And then usually the only one-on-ones I have are my college athletes when they come back into town from their breaks. That's really all I have. Building off what we said before too, I will not add too many kids to a group that I don't feel will jive well with that group.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to add like a random freshman boy who just started playing soccer this year to my junior and senior club volleyball players that are playing at the national level. Like I'm not going to do that. Even though, I mean, you could look at it and be like, oh, the program's relatively the same, but the group dynamics I've noticed is that combined with what the intent we were talking about earlier, intent on what we're doing, but doing that in a group where they want to be there and they thrive off each other. That's like the ultimate combo for like really good results. So it comes back to a blend of don't lose your value, just adding kids to a group where they will suffer and everybody else in that group will also suffer. So within that, I've got elementary groups. That one's not really specific. It's like, oh, you want to come around and play like it's recess, come join. Like that's kind of how that one is.
Yeah.
Middle school, we do a little bit more structure, but it's still free play, and that's the same thing. I don't get too specific with them. It's like, oh, you're here, grab a friend, come in and train. I just throw kids in groups in there. That's fine. But once I get to high school, I can kind of sense out a little bit based on like interviewing with parents and just talking to kids. I'm like, you know what? Right now, I might have a group that comes back after basketball season's over. That'll be a group for you. And like, so I do things like that instead of just, oh yeah, come on in, join this group, because I don't like that. And I want everybody within their groups, even if they're not friends, they come in with little packs, and then eventually they become one giant group that's amazing for each other. And so it's like just like everything else we've talked about, it's like this slow brick by brick. They're just building all this stuff together very slowly. And once you've built and maxed out these groups, it becomes pretty cool to see how well they perform together within the groups.
The coolest thing I think is, so in how I have it set up right now, well, two things actually. One, I'll have sometimes a senior in the same, lifting session as a freshman or a sophomore, and having the senior go and kind of guide them and help them. And I sometimes will give them a little nudge, but like go and help them out. Like they know what's wrong with whatever technique maybe they need help with or anything like that. But then what's also cool is the kids that are the same age, but one just started and one's been with me for 1, 2, 3 years now. I can literally be like, go over there. I want you to take him through his body weight squat. You know what you're looking for, and just having them like help each other. And obviously, I'm there watching and correcting anything I need to. But that part of it, I think, is so cool because they also get those social aspect, the leadership aspect, everything you're kind of building in, and it's just when it's a good group, it's just such a good vibe in the gym. You're just playing music,
Yeah.
having a good time, whatever it is. I think as a kid, I think that's something that I would remember from the time when I'm lifting years down the road. So I want to be able to give that to them because obviously they're not going to be with me forever. But when they are, I want them to enjoy it and remember it.
Yeah, I agree. And so when I say that, I'm not saying that I don't put like freshmen and seniors together in that way.
Oh
What
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
saying,
yeah.
yeah. So like that stuff happens all the time. But like, and it's really cool to see. You'll have like a starter for the basketball team, and a kid who's just trying. The kid that's watching that kid on the court. You're like, okay, so I'm not denying them. Like I'm bringing in some of those kids, but after a month, like a few months or so, if they're really not picking up, and I can tell they're suffering
Oh
because
yeah,
this
yeah.
group just is a little not quite right for them, I'll tell their parents like, hey, right, we tried to see if we can make it work, but I don't think he's getting as much out of it as he can. Go join this other group. I think this could be better. So like that stuff is happening, but like sometimes you got to just throw them in there and be like, you know what? Let's see if they interact with each other. And sometimes it's really cool, like what you were saying. They're like, yeah, seniors going over teaching him, like I have to worry about all these other kids, you go show him how to do something. That's another thing for another kid that's going to grow and develop both of those kids.
Exactly.
And so I do a lot of that, but I still think with the underlying thought in mind of like, let's not put kids in groups where we know they're set up for failure. Sure, there's going to be times where they're going to have to work things out, or they're going to have to pick up speed, because putting them in a pressure situation with some kids that are more athletic than them can be good for a lot of kids. And I do that. But it's like, it's a blend of this group is just holding this kid is really holding this group back, and it's just not a right fit. And I can tell the vibe's not quite there, versus let's see if we can really truly develop this kid by putting him in an uncomfortable spot. And a lot of times they thrive and they become much better for it.
Yeah, 100%. One thing I did want to touch on real quick: how do you approach or answer the questions of the the somewhat still worried parents that think strength training might stunt my kid's growth, or any of these misconceptions that for some people are still around with the area? How do you go about kind of talking them through that and kind of putting them at ease that what we're going to be doing is going to be perfectly safe, and you can trust in us.
Yeah, usually if that's a concern, like I actually had a phone call last week with a parent that had mentioned that. And so usually what I tell them is I'm like, the concern that you have is not as great as you think it is. Yes, and I'm like, if you have something that's very unqualified,
Yeah.
anybody can be in a dangerous situation in the weight room. And so when they have these concerns, usually what I do is I'm like, one, that's a very extreme example. That's not the norm. So I try to establish that first. And then I go on and tell them that when they're coming in to train with me, I've got kids that have been training for a year. If this is your day one, we're going to treat it like your day one. Meaning that if you squat with a goblet, you do a goblet squat with 20 pounds for 4 weeks because it takes you that long to learn it, I am okay with that. And so I give them a kind of a sense of comfort of this is a learning period of time for them. If they're from 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, usually it's the concern is 8th grade and younger. From what I've noticed is usually
Yeah.
where that the concern is.
Yeah.
And so I frame it as let's let them learn so that when they develop, they're off the ground and running as soon as they hit puberty or whatever that is. And usually when I frame it that way, what I say is the kids are going to learn. Normally they learn very, very quickly. And by that point, they're going to be begging me to put more weight on the bar. And even then, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to challenge them to satisfy them, but safety is always in mind. And that's kind of the approach I've taken, and I've explained and gone through a lot of that stuff. And usually by the end, they're like, you know what? I think that's exactly what my kid's looking for. I don't want them to lift heavy, but I want them to do it safely. And so if you phrase it as like a personal development, not only for their confidence, but as they get up and get older and they mature, most parents I've found are pretty on board with that. Usually the ones that aren't on board with that are also the ones that are screaming on social media with not listening to anybody. I've had those too, where people have advocated for me like on the community Facebook pages, and then people who go on there and say, this guy's hurting kids and all this. I'm just like, those people are helpless anyway. But but
Yeah.
most people
Yeah,
are most people are very supportive. And if you have a track record of, because I train a ton of youth athletes, if you have a track record of keeping those kids healthy and safe and learning, and then they go home to their little home gyms that their parents have, and their parents are like, whoa, they're doing stuff with really good form, they're at much ease when they see that happening, even when I'm not in the building.
Couldn't agree more. I do want to be mindful of your time. So one final question that I have for you: what type of impact do you hope to have on your athletes as they kind of graduate out of your program? And obviously, some may come back when they finish school and college and all that sort of stuff, or on break. But just as an overall thing, what type of impact do you hope to have on them?
Well, that's one reason I named my company Perform for Life, is because I want to develop athletes that can advocate for themselves. And when they leave me, they don't need me. They only come to me because they want to be in my presence and I have a good thing going, and they thrive and they feel like they have fun while they're there, while getting progress. But when they leave me, they shouldn't need me.
Mhm.
It's really cool to see when an athlete's been going through a really tough time with like injuries. They come in and then they go, and I teach them like, hey, when you go to a PT, you should ask these questions. They should respond this way. If they're very defensive, then you should start asking them this, like how to navigate a lot of these health avenues. And so I've had a lot of athletes like, yeah, I've been with a PT for 2 years. And once I started challenging what they were doing, I realized that for the last 2 years, it's been BS. And those are the types of things that matter most to me. The progress is cool and watching them develop. But when they leave you and the coaches can see and their parents can see like, hey, like they've grown as people. They know how to go to a gym. They can set up their own gym memberships and program for themselves. They know how to stay healthy. They know what foods are right. They understand what hydration means. Like that's the stuff that really matters to me. And that impact for me is much greater than me increasing a sprint time. But then at the same time, when I've had athletes go off to school for their colleges and be like, dude, like this program is not good.
Mhm.
And they
Yeah.
can see through a lot of these things. And some athletes have gone off to college like this program's great, but they have like a new filter to look at life through. And in business, a lot of times, like, yes, if they don't need me anymore, that's the last time they'll be paying me for something. But for me, that means more than me not teaching them and creating a reliance on me 24/7. That's not what I want. And so that's pretty much, I guess, for all my athletes, the kind of legacy I want to leave with them. So when they leave, they don't need me for anything ever again. The only time they contact me is if they want to be around me, which is fine.
Exactly. And that's one thing I always try to tell my athletes, that I want them to be able to leave my gym and say they're going to play college sports, to be able to step into a gym and have no fear whatsoever, to think that, I'm exactly where I need to be. I know what I need to do. There's no concern at all. Cause I remember having, stepping into my first collegiate gym and being like, whoa, I don't know what's going on in here. And I never want anybody to kind of feel like that. And that's also the great thing is, like, I'm sure you get it as well. You'll get messages from your collegiate athletes saying things like that, whether it's being thankful or just sending a video of like, hey, I hit a 250-pound trap bar today, or whatever it is. Like,
Yeah.
getting those messages are so cool. But yeah, honestly, I know you have sessions to go to, but I really appreciate the time. That was a great chat. Is there anything, as far as where people can kind of reach you or find you, anything you want to leave with them?
Most of my stuff is on Instagram. So if you look up Tommy Hansen on Instagram, you'll probably find most of my stuff. You can find it on every other social media. If you type in Perform for Life or Tommy Hansen, I'm pretty much on all socials. I got a website, performforlifetrainingsystems.com. I do online training. So if you want to get in touch with me there, that's fine too. So type in those things on the internet and hopefully I pop up. Hopefully I'm in that algorithm somewhere. But yeah.
I'm sure you will be. All right. I appreciate it, Tommy. Thanks so much.